Hey everybody, I'm back. The things I had to do, couldn't get them done at the time. So just hopping back on, just expecting some phone calls. So figure I could hop back on and talk about my view on capitalism. I know in a bunch of other episodes, I've addressed the issue of capitalism and economics, my view on socialism, communism, and fascism. So let me quickly talk about my views on capitalism. I think there are people that think I'm kind of a covert leftist because I do criticize capitalism and its modern American itineration. Um, I am for capitalism, a form of capitalism. And I think we have to be specific, just like there are different kinds of forms of socialism. There are many different forms of capitalism, and sometimes you have an economic systems which kind of blends in both of them. Um, so it's really economics to me is not necessarily always a black and white issue when it comes to descriptions. Um, Probably the best in the American context, the closest approximation of my preferred economic model is that what existed between roughly the 1930s and the beginning of the Reagan presidency. I am for that type of capitalism. I think we really can conclude reasonably, and I do not subscribe to libertarian historical and economic orthodoxies anymore. I used to, but I support elements of the New Deal, parts of the progressive legislation with some of the banking laws that were passed, including by Republicans, by the way, as far back as the 19 teens and 1920s. I believe that corporations and labor unions should not have undue influence over the American political process. Instead, there should be mechanisms within the economic bureaucracy, economic apparatus to try and harmonize the relations between capital and labor for the common good. When it comes to economic policy, I would like to see a rollback of Reaganomics, of market fundamentalism, which really took hold in this country almost after immediately Ronald Reagan became president. And there's been a lot of selected deregulation with media, like with the Telecommunications Act, with the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine. It allowed large media consolidation. I don't think that's a good thing. I like small and medium-sized businesses. And I think the best description of capitalism was provided by the left-wing journalist Chris Hedges. He differentiated American capitalism in three stages and three types. One is penny capitalism, regional capitalism, and then globalized corporate capitalism. I support penny capitalism, which is your small town business people, regional capitalism, which Hedges described as, your local textile firm, your regional department store chains that were more of region. It wasn't multinational or national, things of that nature. And then you have corporate capitalism, which tended to be globalized over time, where you had this ethic that believed that communities don't matter, the nation's security don't matter, your shared but earned prosperity of the American people didn't matter, and it was all heavily financialized and devoid of any sense of community, any sense of nationalism, any sense of morality, according to the strictures of the Golden Rule, and really the Milton Friedmans and the Theodore Levitts and the trickle-down supply-side economists of the Larry Kudlows, the Jack Kemps, the Art Loffers, and others. When you really look at their speeches, you look at their writings, their quotations, they're fine with trade with China. In some cases, like George Gilder, they were for deregulation of trade of exports to the Soviet Union. I mean, these were all people that really shaped the Reagan agenda. And they were okay with trade with communist countries for the most part. They were fine with open borders, destructions of the real balance that unions help, labor unions and trade unions, professional unions help keep the balance between management and labor, things of that nature. And really, those forces were really not conservative because they were actually undermining the very institutions that conservatives held dear, like local communities, like, your strong national power, even your military strength too, as well. So really and truly, I support capitalism, but I support capitalism with very strict laws against monopolization in many cases, where competition actually works better. Reagan shut down antitrust. Look at what Robert Bork said. Robert Bork basically said monopolies are okay. I mean, he qualified it a bit, but basically he helped shape antitrust laws. And it's no small wonder that you have a concentration of American business. Why? Because since the early 1980s, since the Supreme Court and the Reagan administration, the Federal Trade Commission, I believe it was, shut down antitrust suits, mergers and acquisitions have been given green lights. And I would put an end to them. I would really severely limit mergers and acquisitions. In fact, I would put a moratorium on them. And I would roll back a lot of the Reagan era tax code. I would put back tax advantages that strongly encourage domestic production, domestic research and development. I would nationalize the Federal Reserve and create the third national bank of the United States. I mean, government banking works well. I mean, take a look at the Dakotas. I believe it was South Dakota, if I remember correctly. And it's not like it's some Stalinist utopia, by the way, or a Nazi Germany. Just because you have certain institutions that are run by the state doesn't mean you're automatically going to have this slippery slope. It's a slippery slope fallacy. Just because you have certain things that are state-owned doesn't mean you're going to have some Stalinist or National Socialist nightmare. And that's where the libertarians are honest. In fact, libertarians really have no right to criticize people like me as being socialists, because most of these libertarians, when you look on the Von Mises Institute, the Ron Pauls of the world, the Club for Growth, they're fine with trade with China. They're fine with trade with Russia. So, I really don't want to hear it. They're prattling about, oh, you're a socialist because you support state regulation or state laws against forms of economic activity, or even some state ownership of key, economic sectors that really need to be, in the name of national security, run by the state. So, when it comes to economics, I'm no longer an ideologue. I used to be a libertarian, total free market guy. I still presume, as a basis of my economic thought, I tend to support free markets as a starting point. But then when you go to the details, when it comes to the issue of deregulation, look, there are some regulations that need to be overhauled or gotten rid of over time. Take a look at the book, The Death of Common Sense, and that provides some good documented, persuasive documentary evidence to show that there needs to be some deregulation, and we need to take a look at the Code of Federal Regulations. But on the other hand, there are a lot of industries, particularly ones that are predatory, that are speculative, financialized industries. Those need to be re-regulated. In fact, there needs to be outright laws that need to be revived to ban certain activities. Stock buybacks. That used to be illegal until Ronald Reagan's head of the Securities and Exchange Commission got rid of that. Said that stock buybacks are fine, as a matter of fact. And, the SEC enforcement apparatus was pared down under Reagan and reduced. There was a reduction in personnel. You need to have this. It's not perfect, but capitalism needs guardrails. And this is one of the areas where I kind of have a lot of intellectual disagreement with people who hold with colleagues of mine who hold similar views on who hold basically similar views on national security issues. We really depart on economics. Um, have I ever heard of, hey, Andrew? Yeah, I've heard of Joe Skousen. Yeah, message retracted. Yeah, I've heard of Joe Skousen. He tends to be a bit libertarianish than I am, but yeah, I've heard of him. I know he aligns himself with Jeff and I on the threat of Russia and China, um, but I think he tends to be a bit too libertarianish for me. Uh, the individuals that I get my no problem, nothing to be sorry about, Andrew. Um, where I get my economic persuasions are from a variety of sources. Some old school traditional conservatives like Anthony Horrigan, who used to be affiliated with the Southern States Industrial Council, and then it was the U.S. Business and Industry Council. He wrote articles in the Spartanburg Journal Herald. He was from South Carolina in defense of economic protectionism. He was a fierce supporter of free enterprise and ironically a fierce critic of unions. But during the Reagan administration, he saw that our trade policies and our financial policies were ruining American industry, and he was deeply concerned about that, to the point where actually he formed temporary alliances with labor unions to really save American industry, which proved to be over the long term unsuccessful. He also wrote highly critical columns in the mid 1980s all the way to the early 1990s, criticizing leverage buyouts, which was another wonderful policy, I mean sarcastically, of Ronald Reagan's deregulation. And that also really ruined a lot of rural areas, small town USA. Reagan ruined small town USA. Another conservative commentator, along with Anthony Horrigan, and ironically he has libertarian leanings, is a guy by the name of Don McIlvaney. He wrote in a McIlvaney Intelligence Advisor, and they were kind enough, McIlvaney Intelligence Advisor, people in Colorado provided me with a copy of it, and I guess somehow if you were able to communicate with me, I can send it to you personally. And there was one, I think, called Disarmament, Disinvestment, and Disinformation or something. And it was talked about how under the Reagan administration, there was massive closures of factories, of family farms, and that had a hugely negative multiplier effect on these rural and Midwestern economies and in the Rust Belt and everything. And that really opened my eyes that the Reagan recovery was just a crock of poop, if you will, that it really was uneven, that Wall Street was doing great. You know, the plutocrats, the multinational corporations, they were doing wonderfully, you know. But mom and pop, Joe and Jane America was in the shitter. And you had extremist groups, we'll talk about it in another live stream, that were making some serious noises, like the Lyndon LaRouche movement, the National Caucus of Labor Committees, which penetrated the Democratic Party. But that's a different story for a different day. So, you know, economists like Pat Choate, he wrote a variety of books, well documented. I've spoken to Pat Choate, very erudite fellow. We look at Michael Lind. We look at Kevin Phillips. Kevin Phillips and Michael Lind used to be stalwarts within the Republican Party and the conservative movement. And in my estimation, they're certainly not leftists, not by my definition, maybe a libertarian or a Reagan conservative, but they consider anybody to the left of Abraham Lincoln or George Washington to be a leftist. But the fact of the matter is that you know, those were some individuals that I really took a look at. You take a look at William R. Hawkins. He wrote a really good article that is available on Kindle. on Reagan. It dated from 1988. It's available on Kindle. I forget the title. Is it like Reagan Recovery or Revolution with a question mark? It was for a publication called The World and I, which was a conservative publication. And that really also blew a hole also in Reagan's tax policies, in his trade policies, and even was critical of his contradictory policies towards the Soviet Union, and other communist countries. So when I took a look at this, and I was introduced to criticisms of Reaganomics from either a centrist, a radical centrist nationalist position, or a conservative perspective. Even what's his name? Sam Francis was even critical of Reaganism too as well. By the end of the late 1980s and into the 1990s. So I looked at all these sources and I'm like, you know what? Reaganism really hollowed out our economy. And when you take a look at it, and I'm going to talk about this later in another live stream, with the decomposition of the American economy, which really gained steam in the 1980s, you had a slow but sure acceptance of far left economic solutions by more and more young people. And I think there's no accident because of that. I'll give you a little example. I like to listen to communists because I like to know what they're thinking. And when you know how to listen to them and interpret what they're saying, they tend to reveal a lot if you know how to decode their language. So I am listening to one such fellow, Caleb Maupin, and he used to work for Russia Today and also the Iranian Press TV. He's a hardcore tanky, hardcore communist, and he used to be affiliated with the Workers' World Party. Well, he had on his YouTube channel, Caleb Maupin, 8 days ago, live stream number 355, Saturday Night Chat with Caleb. Caleb Maupin was talking about the history of the new communist movement in the 1970s. And what he said was very fascinating. He said that they really couldn't get much steam, particularly with the white working class in Detroit and elsewhere, because you had something what communists refer to as a labor aristocracy, meaning because they were beneficiaries of strong labor unions, which meant they became middle class as long as you work and show up to work and semi-productive or productive. You're going to have a good job with a pension and a home and the upward mobility for the kids and everything else. And the new communist movement agitators, they were Maoists. Well, they couldn't make headway with the white working class. Even the black working class at that point were also slowly gaining rights and gaining prosperity. And it just wouldn't work with them. It wouldn't work. It wouldn't work because they were doing well. And this is a communist admitting that. How do you beat communism? This is where I have some severe differences with our fellow analysts on this. You need to repudiate deregulation, union busting, free trade, the exploitation of immigrants, undocumented or documented, legal, illegal, whatever term you want to use for them. Labor arbitrage from exploitation of immigrants of all types. Right to work laws need to go in the shit can of history. I know I'm going to piss a lot of you off when I say that. You say, oh, you're leftist. No, these might be progressive policies. But the reality is you're going to have a right-wing outcome. With what I'm advocating, you're going to have a right-wing, traditional, conservative outcome. Stable communities, strong national security. You're going to beat the communists. You're going to make them look like a bunch of crazy extremists because, hey, Joe and Jane America are doing well. We're working hard. We show up 9 to 5, put in some overtime. We can take a vacation. Local company given to the local baseball team, more money in your pocket, jingle, 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 which means you can tithe maybe a little more than what the 8% is mandated by the Bible to your church. Company gives to your little league because it's a local company, a local textile mill or whatever. The unions are staffed by social democrats and they're strongly anti-communist. We're talking hard hats with baseball bats going against the extreme Bolsheviks in the streets. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about here. We need to not only dump Marxism and racist totalitarianism of neo-Nazis, but we also need to, as Matt Trevisano, who is an ex-libertarian who used to have a blog, he had a title called Dump the Tea Party. I think it's time to dump the Tea Party. And in some ways, we got to dump Trumpism. I supported Donald Trump in 2016, and I know other people that supported Trump. And there's 25% of him I agree with. I mean, Biden's an unmitigated disaster, both from an anti-communist nationalist position and a populist position. Biden is crap all over the place. Jeff and I have talked about that a lot. I've talked about it in my writings and Turning the Page, my latest book. But the fact of the matter is we need to dump Reagan. We need to dump Reaganomics. We need to dump market fundamentalism. Now, on the other hand, the people that say we got to shoot the rich, or just because the rich have more than me, as an ideological statement, it's not I'm not talking about tax fairness, because yes, we're going to talk about why I feel the billionaires and the multimillionaires need to pay more taxes than they do. And there's a lot of conflicting data. Don't believe what Fox News and Stuart Barney and Larry Kudlow and all those other people believe, because they're not credible in my eyes. They've been wrong about so much. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But getting back on track here, I'm not a socialist, I'm not a fascist, I'm not a communist. Just because I see a rich guy rolling down the street in a Rolls Royce, I don't hate him or her because of that. I don't care if they have 10 yachts. I don't care about that. What I care about is what they do to the country, how they treat their workforce. Jeff Bezos is obnoxious about it. You're paying your workers crap wages in horrible conditions. You know, one wag referred to it as dot communism, where Maoism meets corporate globalized capitalism, to describe how Amazon runs its fulfillment centers, which Orwellian term for warehouses. Well, when he buys these multi-mansions, yeah, I think guillotines. Maybe not that bad, but yeah, my face gets real red. And he also does a heavy amount of closely tied business with communist China. So a lot of American multinationals. But when you're treating your workers like widgets and not human beings, remember the golden rule in the New Testament? I'm sorry, I have no sympathy for you. I'm not going to shill for you. To me, if you drop dead, well, you know, I'm not going to mourn your loss. But it's because how they act to their workforce in their country when they have the money to give their people a raise. And that money that can go into your workers' pockets then gets recycled into the community, contrary to what the supply siders with their counterintuitive dogma says. When people like average people, small businessmen, the teachers, the warehouse worker, the worker at Walmart or whatever, they have more money in their pocket. That means they pay off their credit cards. That means they take their family on a vacation. They can go out to dinner. That gets circulated in the community. One other individual, one of a number of billionaires and multimillionaires that I really like and respect on strict economic issues, Nick Hanauer, he talks about this a lot. And he's right. Just think about it. Free your mind from Mark Levin, Ronald Reagan, Larry Kudlow, and Fox News, and think with your brain. Think with your brain. You are all smart. All of you who listen to this program are very smart individuals. You know what I'm saying is true? In your heart of hearts, if you're not an ideologue of the extreme left or free market or corporate right, what I'm saying is makes sense. Now, when it comes, and Andrew, I'll get to your point in a moment, because that's an excellent question that you have here, Andrew. When it comes to tax policy, my mantra when it comes to taxation is as high. Oh, well, let me rephrase that. I'm like stumbling on my word. As low as possible and as high as needed. That's my tax policy. It's not ideological. I don't like high taxes because they're, for the sake of high taxes, just because I want to get those rich bastards. And I'm not for low taxes either, that, the advocates of low taxes says, well, there's a tax cut for every economic problem in the United States, and tax cuts are going to immediately work. No. We need to go back to the pre-Reagan tax laws. And we also need to have a flat across the board 25% tariff across the board, incrementally raised as a part of our protectionist trade program. It worked. This country didn't become a Stalinist or fascist nightmare when we had that. And we actually had a lot of prosperity too as well. Certainly a lot of heavy industry. And when you have a combination of economic nationalism, a type of capitalism that emphasizes production at the expense of financial speculation, truly structurally encourage balanced relations between management, the owner class, and labor. And yes, I would support it to the Constitution. I would support a second Bill of Rights, aspects of it. When you look at the second Bill of Rights, you take a good look at it on the surface itself. There's a lot that actually stabilizes capitalism. And in the aftermath of World War II, you had Stalin, you had Soviet central planners like Eugen Varga, for example. They really did not like reformism to the capitalist system. The American Communist Party, CPUSA, didn't like it either. So, and the other part is not only there's several reasons why I support the pre-Reagan tax structure. I think it's time the billionaires, and there are some patriotic billionaires and a fair number of patriotic millionaires, so I don't want to generalize. However, many of these billionaires also made decisions, along with the wealthy majority activist shareholders, to support the outsourcing of American industry, including to enemy country, geopolitical enemies like Russia and China. And when you export this technology and know-how abroad to geopolitical enemies or vulnerable, abroad where you're at the mercy, the American market is at the mercy of vulnerable supply chains, you're really impairing our national security. And you're putting a strain on the military budget. And you're putting a strain on communities across the nation, thereby forcing people to take out loans for college, to go on the meager social welfare services like Section 8, food stamps, other forms of transfer payments and everything. And this is because you have the private sector oligarchs, many of them making these types of decisions. And they need to pay. They need to pay what I term a national defense progressive tax. And people like Tim Cook, Jeff Bezos, the Koch brothers, and the Walmart crew, to give you some examples, those people need to pay. They need to pay a heavy tax. I'm not saying tax them out of existence, but they need to pay heavy tax. And we need to have an empowered IRS that will go after their asses. And I'm sorry, if I lose a few subscribers, I'm sorry, I got to be me. Because the point is, my priority is to maintain a strong and powerful United States that is as socially unified as possible, where the class struggle is abated, because you have class polarization like crazy. And it's not because of big government. It's because private sector oligarchs own the store. They own the Supreme Court majority. They own many state legislatures. They own the Congress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they need the billionaires as a class and the multimillionaires, and there are patriotic ones and good ones that I would happily bring in our government, but there are many others that are not. They admit they're not loyal to the United States or any other country. I mean, Jack Welch of General Electric, who was heralded at one time not too long ago under the Obama administration by conservatives like Ted Cruz as being this great American businessman. Well, he said back in the late 1990s, Jack Welch said, well, my ideal company is I just throw it on a barge and sail this barge to any country that has favorable, cheap labor rates and regulatory rates where they can pollute the air and not have any consequences. So people are not loyal to the United States, and thereby they need to be coerced into, well, basically being true American citizens. It's time for them to be citizens, not legally just citizens taking advantage of all the privileges and freedoms incurred by American citizenship. They need to prove their loyalty. And I'm tired of conservatives and right-wingers and even good anti-communists shilling for the billionaires. To me, yes, this program, we're going to shit on the billionaires, not because they have more stuff than the average person. No, it's because of the decisions that they make, and the subterfuge they use under the guise of free speech and freedom to hijack our political system and to aid and abet our enemies. And so I am for capitalism. I'm not even saying nationalize big business, but we need to get back to the pre-Reagan era. We need to have a new deal that will truly build American infrastructure that everybody can use, high-speed internet, post office, electrification, repowering our power plants using coal, oil, nuclear, solar, wind, waste to energy, et cetera, improvements for our highway system, converting, if feasible, Amtrak into high-speed rail. I mean, there were conservative enthusiasts for high-speed rail and railway improvements. Look at Paul Weyrich, for example. At the end of his life, he wrote essays in support of renewing our railway system. Yeah, you're not going to learn that on Rush Limbaugh and Mark Levin with their screeching, annoying voices. I mean, Rush Limbaugh is no longer alive, so let's dump on Mark Levin. He's so annoying and nasty. He's an asshole. I'm sorry. I don't like the guy. And he also was kind of pro-China to some degree too in the trade question until Trump came in and, changed the whole conservative orthodoxy on that. Now, Andrew, you mentioned what convinced me to question Reagan's collapse of the Soviet Union thing. Yeah, great point, Andrew. Great question. Just reading the evidence over the years, reading J.R. Nyquist's columns, reading the New American magazine, but then not taking their word for it necessarily. So I started to read a lot of the evidence and through LexisNexis, Academic Universe, and other academic journals, reading certain documents available on the National Security Archive and the Cold War International History Project at Princeton University. And I just kind of put two and two together, and I started to really question things. And you could see a lot of my information that I put on the fall of the Soviet Union. Well, I mean, by my book, the Turning the Page, it's a 2-volume book. And I talk about, a lot of this evidence that really convinced me that, that the collapse of the Soviet Union, that there are a lot more questions than really answers about that. I started to look at, as far back as the mid-1990s, information presented to me by Don McIlvaney when I was at John Bircher. They kind of presented evidence that showed that that Reagan had a very contradictory policies towards various anti-American dictatorships. He did some very good things on that front in supporting the allies of the United States in the 1980s, but he also did a number of things that were really bad that undermined the efforts of his anti-communist policies. And by his second term, he really started to move towards an accommodation with the Soviet Union. He ignored, at least on the surface, the renewed Soviet propaganda offensive and disinformation offensive, as basically expounded by Mikhail Gorbachev and Georgy Arbatov and other Soviet Communist Party ideologues and strategists that said, let's take away the image of the enemy of the Soviet Union, which in turn will disarm the American military industrial complex. Reagan didn't listen to that. He appointed individuals like C. William Verity as Secretary of Commerce. He was the head of the USTEC, the U.S. Soviet Trade and Economic Council, which on the Soviet side consisted of KGB officers, including generals and Soviet Foreign Trade Ministry officials and corporate officials. And then the other side, it was a major American multinational corporations, some of whom were military contractors like General Electric. And he was the head of USTEC, and Reagan appointed him. The only one who opposed Verity's nomination was Senator Jesse Helms, on foreign policy, one of the few last great American senators. I wanted to kind of plug in with the Koch brothers. I got to shit on the Koch brothers because they support everything us on this channel oppose. I mean, the Koch brothers hate unions, they hate workers, they want to deregulate everything, open the borders, and guess what? Koch Industries is continuing to do business in Russia. It's all over. Just do a Google search on that. Koch Industries is continuing to do, all their subsidiaries are doing business to this day with the Russians. And in fact, the Koch-funded right-wing libertarian globalist so-called activist groups, they all oppose sanctions on Russia. Judd Legum and Rebecca Crosby. There's an article, as Koch Industries continue business in Russia, Koch-backed groups oppose sanctions. And then you have another article, Judd Legum, Koch Industries continues doing business in Russia. I'm not going to read all the article. And this is what controls the Republican Party. And still, despite Trump, still has tremendous control over the Republican Party and still are huge donors. This is why big money should not be in politics. And that's a whole different discussion unto itself. So, in summary, I support capitalism, but I support what is known as stakeholder capitalism, combined with a healthy economic nationalism. I support the ideology as expounded by Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln, and Henry Carey of the American School of Political Economy. And I supported many aspects of Roosevelt's New Deal, Social Security. I support heavy amounts of non-communist but strong labor union organizing drives. I oppose right to work. I support widespread ownership of business and entrepreneurialism, free of these massive mega conglomerate monopolies. I absolutely oppose economic globalism. Not to say I don't support trade between free nations, but it has to be based on product quality, not cheap labor, not subsidies or anything like that. We import a Toyota simply because it's a good product based on product quality. But our tariffs are going to be constructed so we can get rid of and neutralize the subsidies that the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Germans, the actual as well as hidden subsidies that are provided. We need to reindustrialize the United States. We need to get away from this financialized and heavily service-oriented economy. We need to get away from that. We can't be a nation of baristas and Walmart clerks and Wall Street executives. They are important parts of the economy, but not. And when you have a strong working class that is satiated, that feels their government has their back, when the working poor have opportunities, and yes, I am for government programs. I think certain majors, college and university majors, should be fully covered by the taxpayer as long as you have at least a B- or above an average. Yeah, I do believe in certain majors: teaching, engineering, medicine, biology, computer science. Yes, if you come from a background where you don't have a pot to you know what in, yeah, should be covered by the taxpayer. You know why? Because that's a long-term investment. Because those people might be able to, even though they come from a poor or middle class background, yeah, those people might be able to invent certain technologies that might be used to better America's national community, or it might be able to create enhanced weapon systems to protect the United States and whatnot. And yes, instead of that money being dumped in college loans and interest, these exorbitant charges, no, that money can be then put into starting a family. Wow, I thought conservatives were for starting family, all about family values. Well, here you go. Populism and civic nationalism, we are for family values. You know, the medical system. I'm all for private competition and privatized medicine when it comes to the actual delivery of medicine. But insurance companies don't care. Tell me an private insurance company that actually cares about their clients, the patients. Okay? I've never had an insurance company that actually cared about their patients. I can tell you stories. Okay? It's not because of big government, it's because insurance companies are motivated, many of them publicly traded, are concerned about amassing gargantuan profits for the majority shareholders. Again, goes back to Milton Friedman, Theodore Levitt, and others. They push this idea that shareholder supremacy is the only important thing when it comes to corporate governments. Well, that hasn't worked out. In fact, one of its adherents, supposedly Michael Jensen, actually repudiated that. But that's here nor there. So yeah, when it comes to insurance, I would like a Medicare for all system, balanced by private sector delivery of medicine and private sector nonprofit hospitals. There was a one time before Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton where this actually occurred. We didn't end up like Cuba, which had a socialized medicine, which was all predicated on control and rationing and shortages and nightmare. I don't support socialized medicine. I don't think the doctors should be employees of the state, because then you have no accountability. Because there you're actually providing a direct service. Insurance companies, really, it's just a money industry. They don't really provide an actual service, an actual trade, if you will. You're not plying a trade. You're just raping and harvesting money from consumers. That's all it is. And what I'm saying, I know, is controversial, but if you put the program that I'm emphasizing, when you're as a government and as a capitalist class, you show you actually care about your people. You have a sense of solidarity with your people as an elite, as Jeff refers to, this old-fashioned aristocratic mentality, not an aristocracy based on money, not a plutocratic aristocracy, but an actual elite that acts like an elite, that shows leadership, that shows integrity, that shows adherence to the golden rule. Then you're going to have your people more so behind you. And then you're not going to have communists and neo-Nazis trying to agitate and gaining converts over time. That's all I have to say about that. So I support a form of capitalism, but I don't support the capitalism as expounded by a lot of your average Republicans and Tea Partiers and libertarians and the folks on Fox News and even CNBC. I don't support that. I'll conclude again, finally. Chris Hedges, left-wing journalist. 3 types of capitalism: penny capitalism, regional capitalism, and corporate capitalism. I strongly support regional capitalism and penny capitalism. Big time. We've all gone to these local businesses, and they have nice people, and they're pillars of the community, and they're friendly for the most part, and they give to the community. There are brothers and sisters of the community. They love our country. They hang American flags, and they mean it. Those people, those guys and gals, I support to the hilt. I even support corporate capitalism in the sense that it's tightly controlled to preserve shared but earned prosperity, as well as preserving our national security. But uncontrolled corporate capitalism, I adamantly oppose that. And that's it. And that's where I stand on that. That is a good 3rd position or 4th position from libertarian free market fundamentalism with deregulation and corporate capitalism and globalism on one side, and ultra-collectivist solutions of the totalitarians on the other side. I have an actual true, in my opinion, what used to be considered centrist position. A true radical centrist populist position that will ultimately take the wind out of the sails of neo-fascism and Marxist-Leninism and other iterations of totalitarian socialism. So that concludes this stream, and I thank you all for listening.